Welcome to The Critique, where today we are looking at a piece arguing that a radical socialist movement is systematically taking over the Democratic Party, using low-turnout primaries as their weapon. A compelling argument requires its localized evidence to logically support its macro-level conclusions without internal contradiction.
Right. And the weakness right out of the gate here is a pretty pronounced logical friction between the data provided and the broad, sweeping conclusions drawn from it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the text explicitly acknowledges that, the majority of Democrat voters, in fact, don't support socialism.
Right.
And it points out that the New York primary had an abysmal 15% turnout.
Which is just, 33,000 votes?
Yeah, only 33,000 votes secured the victory in a district of 750,000.
Wow, yeah.
But then, literally moments later, the script asserts that this extreme socialism is now the dominant, controlling ideology of the entire party.
Right, and that voting for any Democrat equals supporting a communist takeover.
Exactly. And this numerical disparity...
Using a tiny fraction of apathetic voters, right?
Yeah, using that tiny fraction to declare a total nationwide ideological conquest. It just gives a skeptical reader an easy logical off-ramp to dismiss the argument as fundamentally contradictory.
Oh, completely. When you put those two things side by side, the brain of a neutral reader just kind of stalls out.
Yeah, they look at 33,000 votes out of 750,000 people and think, well, if it's so dominant, why did 85% of the districts stay home?
Exactly. You can't tell me I'm facing a massive invisible army and then, show me a photograph of an empty battlefield.
It makes the reader feel like the author is trying to pull a fast one.
So the suggestion here is to reconcile this local voter apathy with the national threat by framing the argument around institutional vulnerability rather than mass ideological conversion.
I really like that approach. By shifting the focus to how systemic levers can be hijacked, the low turnout becomes the weapon, right? Not a contradiction.
Exactly. You don't lose that 33,000 number because it's a great piece of verified data.
Right, you just change the angle of the spotlight.
Yes. So, for some concrete examples for improvement, the author should remove the absolute claim that this is the dominant voter ideology.
Okay, so instead, frame that 15% turnout as a tactical exploitation.
Like a highly motivated radical minority is quietly taking over unengaged districts.
Oh, yeah.
You could use an analogy here. It's less like a hostile army conquering a willing populace and more like, say, a small group changing the locks on a house while the homeowners are asleep.
Oh, I love that lock-changing analogy that makes it so much more insidious.
Right? Because it completely changes the genre of the piece.
It goes from a zombie movie to a heist movie.
Yes. Furthermore, instead of claiming every Democrat vote is a vote for communism, nuance the claim to state that voting for the establishment enables leaders who are just too passive to stop these fringe takeovers.
Yes, that makes the threat feel much more realistic to a moderate reader. But I have to ask, does highlighting this microscopic 33,000 vote count actually defang the nationwide Bolshevik-style threat the author is trying to build, unless we explicitly explain how such a small number wields outsized power?
It absolutely defangs it. If you don't connect those dots, the reader just thinks, well, nobody showed up, so who cares?
Right, exactly. You have to explain the mechanics of the heist.
Which naturally brings us to the actual radicals themselves and how they operate. Maximizing the persuasive impact of shocking evidence requires letting the primary source do the heavy lifting rather than immediately escalating into unearned hyperbole.
Yes, and the weakness in the current draft is how quickly it abandons its strongest, most verified piece of evidence in favor of extreme rhetorical escalation.
It really does. I mean, the material cites this genuinely provocative quote from the Columbia University Apartheid and Divest student group.
Right, and the quote mentions the total eradication of Western civilization.
Yeah, and seeking instruction from militants in the global South.
Which is highly effective on its own.
It is. When you have a quote like that, you are holding absolute gold.
But here is where the piece loses me.
Yeah?
The author insists that that's not hyperbole, but then they immediately follow it with claims about leaders soliciting lessons from warlords in Africa.
Oh, right, and renowned experts in killing white people.
Yeah, that jump is just really jarring.
It is a rapid leap from a factual, concerning quote to exaggerated, apocalyptic imagery.
And it just overshadows the actual extremism of the candidate's background.
It gives the reader an excuse to tap out. It allows a neutral reader to classify the entire segment as a sensationalized rant rather than a factual warning.
Exactly. It's a classic case of a writer not trusting their own evidence.
You see it all the time. You present a terrifying fact, but you feel this, internal anxiety that the audience won't be as outraged as you are.
So you put a hat on a hat. You add these extreme scenarios to force the reaction.
Right, so the suggestion is to anchor the rhetorical escalation firmly to the provided text.
Meaning you have to force the audience to confront the literal reality of the candidate's platform.
Exactly, without giving them an excuse to roll their eyes at exaggerations.
So for concrete examples for improvement, the author could break down the specific phrasing of the candidate's Instagram post line by line.
Oh, I like that. Make it really analytical.
Yeah, just ask practical questions like, what does seeking instruction from militants in the Global South practically mean for a sitting congressional representative?
That is a much scarier question than just throwing around the word warlord.
Right? You draw a direct line between the phrase our Antifa and actual mundane legislative or foreign policy proposals.
Yeah, you just compare the candidate's exact literal words to mainstream policy expectations to highlight the radical departure.
Exactly. Just entirely omit the rhetorical flourishes about warlords. Let the terrifying nature of the actual quote stand on its own.
Because, if we just dissect the exact undeniable words of this student, isn't that inherently more chilling and persuasive to a centrist reader than tacking on our own exaggerated commentary about killing experts?
It is 100% more chilling because it is real.
You can't argue with the quote.
Right, but you can argue with the warlord's comment. The moment you jump from militants to experts and killing white people, a phrase the student group didn't actually use and stop evaluating the terrifying quote and start evaluating the author's emotional state.
Exactly. You give the skeptical reader an exit hatch.
Yeah, they look at the text and say, wait a minute, the quote didn't say anything about African warlords. The author's just making things up now.
And the moment they think you were exaggerating one detail, they give themselves permission to ignore all the other completely factual details.
Which is exactly what you don't want.
Right. Okay, moving to the structure at the end. The strongest structural conclusions integrate supporting examples organically rather than tacking on entirely separate grievances that dilute the core thesis.
Yes, and the weakness in the final section of this material is a sudden loss of thematic focus.
It really does kind of go off the rails at the end.
It does. The script effectively introduces Senator Chris Murphy's social media post to demonstrate establishment capitulation to those 33,000 radical voters.
Yeah, that was a really strong connection to make.
It takes the local New York primary data and connects it directly to the national establishment's response.
But instead of letting that land, the argument abruptly veers into an entirely unrelated tangent about Kamala Harris being installed without votes.
Right, and then it pivots entirely again.
Yeah, into this history of trans activists browbeating the party into supporting taxpayer-funded sex changes for undocumented immigrants in prison.
Which, while meant to show a pattern of submission, just feels like completely separate, bolt-on grievances.
It is kitchen sink syndrome.
Yeah, they act as a sudden channel change that distracts the listener from the specific New York primary data.
And from that eradication of Western civilization quote that formed the whole foundation of the piece.
Right. You are opening brand new files in the reader's brain right when you should be closing them.
Exactly. So the suggestion here is to tightly weave the theme of establishment capitulation back to the core premise of institutional takeover.
Meaning you only use historical parallels if they directly map onto the mechanics of the primary election just discussed.
Precisely. So concrete examples for this would be cutting the Kamala Harris nomination tangent entirely, just because it disrupts the logical flow.
Yeah, that one has to go. It introduces a completely different mechanism of party politics that doesn't relate to a 15% voter turnout in the local primary.
It's just a distraction. And if the trans ideology comparison is kept, it must be explicitly framed as the tactical template for the current crisis.
Oh, I see.
Because right now it reads like just another item on a grievance.
Yeah, it's just, piling on.
Exactly. So instead of just complaining that the party supported those policies in the past, you write something along the lines of, just as violent activist pressure forced moderate silence on gender issues years ago, we are seeing the exact same institutional cowardice today in response to anti-Western socialism.
Okay, that makes sense. You are saying they surrendered before, and here's the exact blueprint of how they're surrendering again.
Yes, you frame the past action not as a separate outrage, but as the precedent.
The precedent for why Chris Murphy is ignoring the danger of those 33,000 voters right now.
You use the history to reinforce the current thesis.
And then you bring the conclusion right back to Chris Murphy's tweet.
Using his capitulation as the ultimate proof of the danger of that 15% turnout mentioned at the top of the piece, you close the loop.
Because, it feels a bit like a prosecutor laying out a meticulous case for embezzlement, and in their closing argument, suddenly complaining that the defendant also ran a red light 3 years ago. Doesn't bringing in the taxpayer-funded surgeries for inmates at the very end completely dilute the sharp focus on the socialist primary takeover we started with?
It absolutely does. It leaves the reader thinking about the tangent instead of the core warning. You have to lock that specific narrative into the listener's mind.
Right, the vulnerability of a low-turnout election hijacked by extremists enabled by a passive establishment.
Exactly. By trimming all that excess outrage at the end, the core warning becomes impossible to ignore. You're just sharpening the blade.
That's a great way to put it.
So, to recap this critique, the material presents a passionate and urgent perspective, but its impact can be significantly amplified by refining its logical consistency, emotional restraint, and structural focus.
Yeah. First, resolve the friction between the low voter turnout and the claims of a massive party takeover by focusing on systemic vulnerability and tactical hijacking rather than broad ideological shifts.
Second, let the shocking primary source quotes speak for themselves instead of burying them under immediate rhetorical hyperbole, which will keep skeptical audiences engaged.
And finally, streamline the conclusion by removing bolted-on grievances, ensuring that comparisons to past party capitulations directly serve the core argument about the New York primary.
We highly encourage the author to apply these structural and tonal adjustments and submit the revised work back to us for another critique.